One spring afternoon in 1999, a well-liked auto shop owner left his garage to assist a stranded motorist on a rural Colorado road and was never seen again. The disappearance of 42-year-old Dale Williams in Nucla, Colorado, baffled his community and law enforcement for decades. It's a tiny town in western Colorado, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. So when Dale vanished, it shook the town to its core. Williams was known for his generosity. He dressed as Santa at Christmas, drove the high school homecoming parade car, and always stopped to help drivers in need. Disturbingly, his helpful nature may have led him into a trap, leaving behind a mystery that endured for years. Recently, though, there's been an extremely significant breakthrough in the case, though as you'll see, justice still may remain elusive. On May 27, 1999, Dale Williams went to work at his auto body shop as usual. Around midday, he received a phone call from someone needing roadside assistance near the tiny community of Bedrock. A friend who was with Dale later recalled that the caller sounded like a distressed woman. It was odd. Dale's shop specialized in body work, not towing, yet he didn't hesitate to help. It wasn't clear from the context if he knew the woman or why the woman chose to call his shop, but Dale was a really great guy, as you'll see. He left in his white Ford pickup truck to assist the motorist and never returned. When Dale failed to come home that evening, his wife Diana immediately grew concerned. By dawn the next day, she went to his shop and found the door unlocked, a vehicle still on the lift, and Dale's tools left out as if he had stepped away only minutes earlier. His older daughter's high school graduation was just days away, a milestone Dale would never have missed. Knowing this, family and friends feared something was very wrong. They searched local roads and even junkyards, thinking he might have had an accident, but found no trace. Later that day, May 28th, Diana contacted law enforcement and filed a missing person report. Weeks of searching passed with no leads whatsoever. Then, on July 4th, 1999, campers discovered Dale's pickup truck submerged in a muddy river at a remote spot where the Dolores and San Miguel rivers meet. The location was only a few miles from where the mystery caller had claimed to be stranded. Investigators noted that the truck's ignition was on, and it was in low gear, yet tire tracks showed it had rolled slowly off the road into the water without any sign of braking. This suggested it was deliberately sent into the river rather than a random accident. There was still no sign of Dale himself. However, a crucial piece of evidence was recovered: a rifle found in the bed of the truck. Records later showed that this rifle belonged to one of Dale's acquaintances, 43-year-old Dan Bishop. Finding the truck gave investigators hope, but instead it deepened the mystery. With the vehicle offering more questions than answers, attention turned to what role Bishop might have played, if any at all. Dan Bishop had been a longtime friend of the Williams family, which made what investigators learned next even more disturbing. A year earlier, Dale and Diana had helped Bishop's wife escape their marriage, relocating her to another state. It had turned out that Dan Bishop was an aggressive and violent individual with his wife, and she believed that he would take lethal action if she tried to leave. Bishop was enraged that Dale aided his wife's departure and that the couple refused to reveal her whereabouts. In the months after that, a series of bizarre incidents targeted Dale. Someone broke into his shop and left torn-up photos of the Williams and Bishop families outside, along with a handful of bullets scattered on the ground. Days later, Diana discovered that a revolver missing from the shop had been dropped into the overnight slot of her video rental store. Another ominous message. These intimidation tactics were never definitively linked to Bishop at the time, but they certainly raised red flags around him. A few weeks after Dale disappeared, Friends and family plastered Nucla with missing person flyers. It seemed like everyone in the small town was willing to help out their good-natured neighbor, but then something weird began to happen. Someone began to tear down the missing persons posts of Dale, a fact that baffled his family and friend, as well as investigators. A hidden camera was set up and caught Bishop himself tearing down the posters at the post office. The fact that a so-called close friend was sabotaging efforts to find Dale stunned everyone. And trust me, based on what happened in 2024, I'm actually shocked that he did this as well. Very odd behavior. But I'll come to that in a moment. When police questioned Bishop, he denied any involvement in the disappearance and claimed he removed the flyers for personal reasons. According to investigators, he also provided an alibi for May 27th that they believe mostly checked out. With no body and only circumstantial clues in 1999, authorities had no choice but to let him go. Still, Bishop remained the prime focus of suspicion in the years that followed. From there, the case would go increasingly cold over the next decades. And of course, I have to mention that this case was covered on Unsolved Mysteries. Unfortunately, though, this didn't turn up any new actionable tips. It wasn't until late 2023 that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and Montrose County Sheriff's Office reopened the cold case with fresh eyes. In reviewing the evidence, investigators found new pieces to the puzzle that strengthened the case against Dan Bishop. The rifle recovered from Dale's truck was conclusively traced back to Bishop. Investigators also discovered that Bishop's cousin, now deceased, may have helped him plan and carry out the crime. One witness claimed this cousin boasted in jail that without a body, they could never be charged for what they did. Of course, this statement is unverified, but still it put a laser focus back on Bishop. That chilling remark took on new significance. Finally, on October 17th, 2024, 25 years after Dale vanished, police arrested 68-year-old Dan Bishop. However, the authorities revealed that the case against Dan Bishop was entirely circumstantial, a fact that concerned many onlookers. Despite the arrest, this story doesn't have a neat ending, not even close. The evidence against Bishop, though compelling, was still circumstantial, and crucially, Dale's body hadn't been found. In early 2025, during preliminary court proceedings, prosecutors decided there wasn't enough proof to proceed to a trial. The charge against Dan Bishop was dropped for lack of sufficient evidence, and he was released from custody. Officials made it clear that the case remains open and that charges can be refiled if new evidence emerges. So there's obviously a ton of open questions about Dale's case, and I'm not going to go into every one of them. What fascinates me most still is that call he received, and who that woman with the apparent car trouble was. If she wasn't in on it, I have to question why she never came forward when it became well known that Dale went missing. Now I know some of you are thinking that she may have just been passing through town, and that she could have even been from outside Colorado. However, once Dale's story went national with the Unsolved Mysteries segment, I would have thought she may have come forward. Unsolved had an absolutely massive reach at its peak, with viewership in the tens of millions, through first runs and reruns. Personally, I think the authorities should be reaching out very hard for this woman to come forward and perhaps offer her immunity for her part in exchange for testimony. After all, if Dale is charged again and this really was a conspiracy, he has a significant incentive to turn on her. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to check out my new channel, Lazy Chill Tales, which features creepypasta-style stories and fact or fiction tales. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the YouTube membership if you want to toss me a clam or two and support my work further. Nestled in southeastern Massachusetts lies a mysterious 200 square mile region that has captivated paranormal enthusiasts for decades, the enigmatic Bridgewater Triangle. This area of alleged supernatural activity stretches across the towns of Abington, Rehoboth, and Freetown, with its influence often spilling into neighboring communities. The legend began taking shape when American cryptozoologist Loren Coleman coined the term Bridgewater Triangle in his groundbreaking 1983 work, Mysterious America. Coleman's fascination with this particular region grew from an intriguing pattern he discovered while researching cryptid and paranormal encounters throughout New England. Time and again, unexplained incidents seemed to cluster within the same geographical boundaries, prompting him to map out what he considered a paranormal hot zone. While Coleman initially focused on cryptozoological creatures, later investigations would cast a much wider net, encompassing all manner of supernatural phenomena. At the heart of the triangle's mystique lies the foreboding Hockomock Swamp. The very name carries weight. In Algonquin, Hockomock translates to the place where spirits dwell. This reveals that this wetland held an otherworldly reputation long before Europeans arrived. This vast protected marshland sprawls across the landscape, its dense vegetation and rich wildlife creating an impenetrable wilderness. But according to numerous witnesses, the swamp harbors more than just natural inhabitants. Reports persist of ghostly orbs dancing through the mist and strange creatures lurking in the shadows. Whether these accounts stem from the area's isolated nature or something far more mysterious, Hockomock Swamp has become the beating heart of the Triangle's dark reputation. The region boasts another puzzling landmark, Dighton Rock, a massive 40-ton boulder resting in the Taunton River. This ancient stone canvas displays intricate petroglyphs that have baffled researchers for centuries. Theories about the mysterious carvings range from Portuguese explorers to Native American tribes, yet their true origin remains tantalizingly elusive. For believers in the Triangle's supernatural properties, Dighton Rock serves as yet another piece of the area's enduring puzzle. Local residents and curious visitors describe witnessing odd objects cutting through the night sky, spectral lights flickering between trees, and enormous birds soaring overhead. Others tell of haunting sounds echoing through the darkness, unexplained calls that seem to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports of massive black dogs that appear suddenly on roadways before vanishing without a trace. Also, just as an aside, why is it never creepy golden retrievers or something like that? I need a story that has sinister goldens. But I digress. Some theorists suggest these phantom canines might be skinwalker-like entities prowling the Triangle's boundaries. Even law enforcement officers have occasionally shared accounts of bizarre incidents within the region, though official explanations for these strange occurrences remain notably absent. Critics dismiss the Bridgewater Triangle as nothing more than fanciful legend building amplified by media attention. They contend that the area's ghost stories and creature sightings likely stem from misidentified animals, elaborate hoaxes, or folklore that has grown more elaborate with each telling. Nevertheless, the Triangle's enduring fascination may lie in its remarkable ability to ignite our collective imagination. New England's rich tradition of mysterious tales finds perfect expression in this region. I've said it before and I'll say it again. New England is by far the creepiest part of America, at least in terms of supernatural phenomena. This place where ancient forests and sprawling wetlands meet creates an ideal backdrop for encounters that defy easy explanation. Or perhaps it just provides the perfect background for a sighting of an owl at night, to be interpreted as something far more sinister. In pitch-black darkness beneath the Arctic waters, A young Russian naval officer scribbled a last message to his wife, tracing the words by touch on a piece of paper. He was one of 23 crew members who survived two devastating explosions aboard the nuclear submarine K-141 Kursk. But the worst was yet to come, and he and the other crew members found themselves trapped 300 feet below the surface with dwindling oxygen. This scenario unfolded in August 2000 when an enormous blast sent the pride of Russia's northern fleet to the bottom of the Barents Sea. The Kursk submarine disaster stands as one of the deadliest submarine incidents in modern history, claiming all 118 lives on board. Launched in 1994, this 450-foot behemoth was about as long as two jumbo jets and equipped with a double hull divided into 9 watertight compartments. Designed during the Soviet era to combat U.S. aircraft carrier groups, it carried 2 nuclear reactors and could fire 24 long-range cruise missiles and a mix of heavy torpedoes. At 24,000 tons of displacement, Kursk was the largest attack submarine in service, roughly 3 times the size of the biggest submarines in the U.S. Navy. It had recently been commended as having the best crew in Russia's northern fleet, and government officials called it, quote, virtually unsinkable. And seriously, I feel like describing a large ocean-going vessel as unsinkable should be permanently banned. In August 2000, Kursk joined the Russian Navy's first major naval exercise in over a decade. Morale was high as this mighty vessel prepared to demonstrate Russia's naval prowess. No one aboard or in the fleet imagined that the upcoming drill would turn into a nightmare. On the morning of August 12, 2000, Kursk was assigned to fire dummy torpedoes at a cruiser as part of the exercise. At 11:28 a.m. local time, as the crew loaded a large practice torpedo into one of the firing tubes, disaster struck without warning. A violent explosion rocked the submarine's forward compartments, equivalent to the blast of about 250 kilograms of TNT. Nearby vessels in the exercise felt the shock wave and heard a muffled boom, but before anyone could react, a second, far more powerful explosion erupted. This blast was massive, on the order of 3 to 7 tons of TNT, and registered as a 4.2 magnitude seismic event detectable as far away as Alaska. The double explosion blew the Kursk wide open and sent the submarine plummeting to the seafloor at a depth of about 350 feet. It came to rest roughly 50 miles off the Russian coast in the icy Barents Sea, a truly desolate hellscape. Inside the sub's first compartments, the force of the blasts instantly killed most of the crew and tore through bulkheads, collapsing the front of the vessel. Out of 118 personnel on board, only a couple dozen in the stern sections were left alive in the immediate aftermath. The exact cause of the initial explosion was later determined to be a leak of high-test peroxide, a volatile torpedo propellant. Investigators found that a faulty weld in the casing of a practice torpedo had allowed the highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide to seep out and react with metal. This in turn triggered a rapid expansion of gas and a fiery blast. This first explosion in turn ignited a fire in the torpedo room. Mere seconds later, as fire raged in the forward section, the heat caused up to 7 additional torpedo warheads to detonate in a catastrophic chain reaction. Kursk's 2 nuclear reactors luckily shut down automatically and avoided a nuclear meltdown. Within minutes, the unsinkable submarine lay crippled on the ocean floor. Shockingly, however, the rest of the fleet didn't immediately realize anything was wrong. Despite the explosions, Russian commanders initially failed to grasp that Kursk had suffered an accident. For reasons that remain unclear, the submarine's emergency systems, which should have signaled distress, had been disabled, potentially on purpose. Despite the loud explosions, it was only hours later, when Kursk missed a scheduled radio check-in, that alarm bells rang. What followed was a desperate but ill-fated rescue operation that unfolded over the next week. The Russian Navy, unprepared for such a disaster, scrambled its available rescue assets once it finally acknowledged that Kursk was missing. It took more than 16 hours after the blast for the Navy to even locate the submarine on the seabed. When rescue ships arrived at the scene, they found the vessel upright on the seafloor, but connecting to it proved incredibly difficult. Over the next 4 days, Russian teams made repeated attempts to dock diving bells and mini-submarines to Kursk's single rear escape hatch. Each attempt failed spectacularly, hampered by poor visibility, strong currents, extreme cold, and outdated equipment. Relations with Russia and the West were at an all-time high when this event occurred, and many countries surprisingly offered to help. However, in a move widely criticized later, Russian authorities initially refused all foreign assistance, saying no to all outside help. Whether due to pride, secrecy concerns, or false optimism, this delay proved fatal. For 5 days, as Russian rescuers floundered, offers from Britain, Norway, and others were rebuffed. Only on the 5th day of the crisis did President Vladimir Putin authorize acceptance of British and Norwegian help. However, by then, precious time had been lost. Disturbingly, by the time British and Norwegian rescue teams arrived on August 20th, they only found a silent compartment where the survivors had been. In the end, all 118 sailors on Kursk were lost, making it one of the worst naval disasters in Russian history. Though most of Kursk's crew died instantly, a group of 23 sailors in the rear compartments survived the initial explosions and lived for several hours hoping for rescue. As the forward sections flooded and went dark, these men, including Captain Dmitry Kolesnikov, moved toward the 9th compartment at the very back of the submarine. They found temporary refuge there, sealing themselves off from rising water. In a note later recovered from Kolesnikov's body, he described how the survivors had gathered in compartment 9 and tried to use the escape hatch. 2 or 3 crewmen apparently attempted to don escape suits and ascend through the hatch, but their plan failed. It's believed that the hatch might have been damaged, or that the men were thwarted by injuries and the flooding waters. And seriously, it's hard to imagine the absolute terror that must have taken hold at that time. In that frigid, pitch-dark compartment, the surviving sailors faced dwindling oxygen and extreme peril. The final moments for these survivors was perhaps the most horrifying fate of all. An analysis later suggested that as oxygen ran low after several hours, the men tried to activate a chemical oxygen generator to extend their air supply. This was a last-ditch effort to survive just a little bit longer. They knew what they were about to do was dangerous. The men had no choice, though. In the wet, oily environment, the generator likely reacted violently with seawater and caused a flash fire or explosion, consuming the remaining oxygen. The final moments would have been terrifying. A sudden fireball in the confined space, then asphyxiation of any who still remained. In the wake of the disaster, Russia faced the challenge of recovering the Kursk and determining what went wrong. Under intense public pressure, Putin agreed to raise the wreck from the seabed for investigation, despite the technical hurdles. An international salvage team led by a Dutch company was contracted at a cost of roughly $100 million to lift the giant submarine. In October 2001, after months of preparation, engineers used a complex array of cables and cranes to hoist the Kursk out of the mud and transport it to a dry dock. Due to safety concerns, they had to cut off the front section, the site of the torpedo explosions, and leave it on the sea floor. This meant some physical evidence of the very cause of the accident was lost, fueling ongoing speculation as to the true cause of the Kursk disaster. Washington's Gifford-Pinchot National Forest stretches across thousands of acres of wilderness, its towering trees and winding trails offering both beauty and danger. In June 2013, this serene landscape would become the setting for one of the region's most baffling mysteries. Maureen Kelly had always marched to the beat of her own drum. Born on September 26, 1993, the 19-year-old Vancouver, Washington resident lived life on her own terms. Friends knew her by the nickname Anu, and they described someone who embodied a free spirit, laid back, carefree, and deeply affectionate with those she loved. Music flowed through Maureen's veins. She dreamed of becoming a singer and songwriter, spending countless hours crafting melodies and sharing her passion with the world. Her YouTube channel showcased her unique talents, featuring videos of herself strumming the ukulele and beatboxing with infectious enthusiasm. Just 2 days before everything changed, she uploaded what would become her final video to her channel, a new, which is still up till this day. June 9th, 2013 began like any other camping trip. Maureen joined a group of friends at Canyon Creek Campground, nestled deep within the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. The day unfolded peacefully until around 5 p.m., when Maureen made an announcement that would forever alter the trajectory of their weekend getaway. She spoke of a spiritual quest, something she'd been contemplating for quite some time. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, but rather the culmination of deep personal reflection. Or at least, that's what her friends thought at the time, according to reports. What happened next left her friends stunned and worried. Maureen methodically removed every piece of clothing and her shoes, keeping only a fanny pack equipped with 3 essential items: a knife, matches, and a compass. "I'll be back by midnight," she promised before disappearing into the forest's embrace. Midnight came and went. Hours stretched into an agonizing wait as Maureen's friends realized their worst fears were materializing. In the early morning hours of June 10th, they contacted authorities to report her missing. The Skamania County Sheriff's Office mobilized quickly, understanding that time was their enemy. Ground teams and K-9 units fanned out across the challenging terrain, following the only clues Maureen had left behind: bare footprints that matched her foot size. The trail told a story. She had crossed Canyon Creek and headed north toward Forest Service Road 54. Then silence. The footprints vanished, and even the most experienced tracking dogs lost her scent completely. The search teams faced a formidable opponent in the forest itself. Dense woodlands stretched endlessly in every direction, punctuated by steep inclines that could challenge even experienced hikers. The rugged terrain seemed to swallow searchers whole, making every step forward a calculated risk. Notably, while the day had been pleasantly mild, nighttime temperatures plummeted into the mid-40s. For someone without clothing or proper protection, hypothermia became an immediate and life-threatening concern. Despite deploying aerial searches whenever weather conditions allowed, the massive search operation yielded nothing. The absence of answers gave birth to multiple theories, each attempting to explain the impossible. The most widely accepted hypothesis centers on exposure to the elements. With nighttime temperatures dropping dangerously low and Maureen having no protection from the cold, hypothermia presented the most logical explanation for her fate. Others wondered whether the region's largely peaceful but sometimes dangerous wildlife might hold the answer to what happened to her. Bears and cougars call the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest home, and an encounter with either could prove deadly. While attacks on humans are extremely rare, they're definitely not unheard of. But this hypothesis has a problem. Searchers found no evidence to support this theory. No signs of struggle, no traces of blood, nothing to indicate a confrontation with wild animals. If she had been mauled by a bear or taken by a cougar, sniffer dogs would have almost certainly been able to get a scent, at least according to experts. As with many mysterious disappearances, some speculated that Maureen might have chosen to vanish intentionally. She was very much a free spirit, and some believe she sought to disappear into the wilderness and start fresh somewhere off the grid. Her family and friends, however, firmly rejected this possibility. They pointed to her strong relationships and the complete absence of any preparation for such a drastic life change. I personally find this theory completely unrealistic, given that she took off into the woods taking virtually nothing with her. As for why she did what she did, many have speculated that she may have suffered some form of mental breakdown. Unfortunately, she was the age where people are most likely to experience a psychotic break, which could explain the why of this tragedy. If this is in fact the case, it's truly tragic to think that she would have likely been safe had this occurred somewhere other than a national park. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved until August 2024 brought unexpected developments. Human remains surfaced in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, discovered near the very area where Maureen had last been seen. Authorities cautiously announced that the remains could potentially belong to either Maureen Kelly or another hiker who disappeared in the same region during 2013. Forensic analyses are now underway, offering the first glimmer of hope for answers in over a decade. On a scorching day in Scottsdale, Arizona, June 29, 1978, police were called to a quiet apartment complex where something was terribly wrong. Inside Unit 132A, they discovered a chilling scene. A shirtless man lay sprawled lifeless on the bed, his head brutally battered, and an electrical cord knotted around his throat. Blood was splattered on the walls and even the ceiling, and the injuries were so gruesome that he was barely recognizable. It turned out to be Bob Crane, the 49-year-old actor beloved as Colonel Hogan from the sitcom Hogan's Heroes. This violent end to a familiar TV star shocked the public and Hollywood alike. Crane's slaying launched an investigation fraught with scandal and speculation, and launched a mystery that remains officially unsolved decades later. Bob Crane's rise to fame had been swift and spectacular. A charming radio personality turned actor, he became a household name as the wisecracking hero of Hogan's Heroes, which ran from 1965 to 1971. The show was an overnight hit that made Crane one of TV's most recognizable faces. After the series ended, however, his career faltered. He took roles in a couple of Disney films and even toured the country in dinner theater productions to make ends meet. By 1978, Crane was in Scottsdale performing in a stage play called Beginner's Luck at the Windmill Dinner Theater, far from the heights of his earlier Hollywood stardom. Behind the clean-cut image of a TV hero, Bob Crane led a secretive personal life that many believe may have caught up with him. He had a well-known obsession with photography and gooning, using his celebrity status to meet numerous women and documenting his escapades along the way. Long before the era of internet videos, Crane amassed Polaroid photos and home videos of his encounters, essentially creating his own private collection. A key figure in this part of Crane's life was his close friend John Henry Carpenter. He was a video equipment salesman whom Crane met through mutual friend and fellow actor Richard Dawson. Carpenter, who worked for Sony, supplied Crane with early video technology and often joined him on nights out cruising for women. Crane would introduce Carpenter as his manager to help facilitate their trysts, and the pair even filmed some of their joint encounters using the latest video gear. Crane's family and friends have maintained that the women involved were willing participants, but the situation was murky. In fact, several women later told police they had no idea they were being recorded until investigators informed them after Crane's death. This unsavory aspect of Crane's private life remained mostly hidden during his heyday, but it gradually became an open secret. His dressing room on set was a den filled with stacks of illicit photos and films. Crane's habit of showing off photographs of himself with women eventually alarmed colleagues and studio executives. In one incident, while filming the family-friendly Disney movie Superdad, Crane passed around explicit photos to crew members on set. This was a reckless move that soon made its way into tabloids and damaged his wholesome reputation. By the late 1970s, his addiction to hot action and filming had not only hurt his career, but also strained his second marriage and potentially set the stage for his killing. In the last week of June 1978, Bob Crane was living in a modest Scottsdale apartment during his theater run. John Carpenter had flown in to visit him on June 25th, planning to spend a few days with Crane while he performed. The two friends were seen dining together and visiting a local nightclub on the night of June 28th, the eve of the slaying. According to some accounts, that evening wasn't entirely friendly. Witnesses later claimed that Crane and Carpenter had an argument at a club, apparently over Crane's trying to distance himself from Carpenter. Crane's son would later testify that his father had wanted to cut off the friendship, finding Carpenter's presence obnoxious and no longer wanting him around. Whether or not a confrontation occurred that night, what is known is that Carpenter returned to his hotel and Bob Crane went back to his apartment in the early hours of June 29th. The next day, Crane failed to show up for a lunch meeting with his co-star, actress Victoria Berry. Concerned, Berry went to his apartment that afternoon and stumbled upon the horrific sight of Crane's body in bed. The scene suggested he had been eliminated while asleep in the early morning hours. He had 2 deep gashes on the side of his head, consistent with being bludgeoned by a heavy object, and a VCR electrical cord was found tied tightly around his neck. Blood soaked the bedding and spattered the room, indicating a violent struggle or attack while he lay in bed. Yet, there were odd clues. There was no sign of forced entry into the apartment, and nothing of value was missing. This indicated that Crane likely knew his killer and had let them in willingly. Scottsdale, at the time a growing upscale community, was not accustomed to such crimes. In a somewhat bizarre twist, it was such a safe place that the local police department didn't even have a dedicated homicide division in 1978. Unsurprisingly, investigators were ill-prepared for a case this complex and high-profile, and the initial handling of the crime scene showed it. As detectives combed through Crane's apartment, they quickly learned about his extensive video collection and extramarital exploits, which pointed them toward John Carpenter. Carpenter, being one of Crane's closest companions and the last known person to see him alive, instantly became the prime suspect. Police noted that there was no break-in, suggesting Bob had opened the door for someone he trusted. When they examined Carpenter's rental car, a critical piece of evidence surfaced. Small blood smears were found inside the vehicle. Testing revealed the blood was type B, the same blood type as Bob Crane, and neither Carpenter nor anyone else known to have driven that car had type B blood. This discovery strongly hinted at Carpenter's involvement, at least according to allegations made by the investigations. However, 1978 forensics had limits. DNA testing did not exist yet, and blood type evidence was only circumstantial. Moreover, detectives never located the weapon used in the crime. They suspected a camera tripod, fitting given Crane's video hobby, as the blunt instrument. Notably, one of Crane's tripods was believed to be missing from the apartment, but they couldn't prove it. The county attorney's office felt the evidence was too weak to charge anyone at that time. Further complicating matters, the investigation had been compromised early on and in a fairly major way. In the chaos after the body was found, Crane's friends were allowed to walk through the apartment and inadvertently tamper with evidence before all forensic work was done. This lack of a pristine crime scene and the generally lax handling of evidence made it harder to build a solid case. Despite the cloud of suspicion around John Carpenter, authorities in 1978 declined to make an arrest, and the case went cold. Years passed with Bob Crane's slaying unsolved, but it was never forgotten. In 1990, a new detective took a fresh look at the evidence, and by 1992, Scottsdale police finally felt they had enough to move on John Carpenter. Investigators had unearthed an old crime scene photo that had been overlooked. It appeared to show a speck of brain tissue in Carpenter's car near the dried blood smears. The actual tissue sample itself had long since been lost, but a judge ruled that the photograph of it was admissible evidence. Bolstered by this and the original blood type matching, prosecutors charged Carpenter with Bob Crane's slaying in 1992, nearly 14 years after the crime. The case went to trial in 1994, and it captivated the public as sordid details of Crane's private life spilled out in court. The prosecution's argument centered on Carpenter's motive and the physical evidence linking him to the scene. They contended that Crane was trying to end his toxic friendship with Carpenter, even alleging that Crane had called Carpenter on the night of June 28th to officially cut ties. According to the prosecution, it was this rejection that enraged Carpenter enough to bash his former friend to death. Crane's son Scotty testified that his father had referred to Carpenter as a hanger-on, whom he needed to push out of his life. Combined with the blood evidence and the missing tripod, the state painted Carpenter as the only person with both the opportunity and personal motive to bludgeon the actor in a fit of anger. Carpenter's defense, however, aggressively attacked the weak points of the case. They pointed out that much of the evidence was circumstantial or tainted by time. Witnesses from the restaurant on June 28th testified that Crane and Carpenter seemed to be on good terms that evening, undermining the theory of a dramatic confrontation. The defense attorney highlighted that no weapon was ever found, and that the camera tripod as weapon idea was purely speculative. In essence, it was an assumption based on Carpenter's occupation and the nature of Crane's hobby, but never proven. Moreover, the defense argued that the police investigation had been sloppy from the start. They emphasized how key evidence had been mishandled or lost, raising doubt about the reliability of the forensic findings. To underscore this, they humiliated the prosecution by pointing out that they had to rely upon a photograph of what appeared to be brain tissue. The defense, without accepting that it was brain tissue as a fact, but accepting it for the point of argument, questioned this. If the police could miss literal brain tissue in the prime suspect's vehicle, it raised some serious questions about what else they missed. Carpenter's team also brought up alternative suspects to widen the scope of reasonable doubt. They noted that Crane's lifestyle involved many women and secrecy, suggesting the possibility that an enraged husband or boyfriend of one of Crane's partners did it. They also suggested that a family member of a woman who was unaware that Crane had recorded her may not have taken kindly to that fact and caved in Crane's head. Simply put, they emphasized that if he was actually doing things like that, it was only a matter of time, and he basically got what he deserved. In addition, they referenced a troubling incident. A few months before the attack, Crane had gotten into a heated argument with another actor in Texas. That man had allegedly threatened Crane's life to such a degree that those familiar with him reported that Crane was legitimately worried for his life. Any of these scenarios, the defense argued, meant that Carpenter was far from the only person who might have had a motive to kill Bob Crane. After weeks of testimony that laid bare the late actor's private vices, the jury remained unconvinced of Carpenter's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Carpenter walked free, maintaining his innocence, and died in 1998 of natural causes, taking with him any answers he may have had about that night. For Crane's family, it was a bitter outcome. They had sat through the scandalous revelations of trial, only to see the lone suspect go free. Officially, the case returned to unsolved cold case status, with no one held accountable for the crime. Bob Crane's slaying remains one of Hollywood's most perplexing cold cases, and over the years it has attracted a web of theories. In the court of public opinion, many still agree with the original investigators that John Carpenter was the likely killer who evaded justice. After all, a jury can't find someone innocent. They can only find them not guilty, and not guilty means that the state failed to prove the elements of an offense beyond a reasonable doubt. With the mystery still unsolved, speculation runs rampant. One controversial theory came from Crane's eldest son, Robert, who has at times alleged that his stepmother, Crane's second wife, may have been involved. At the time of Bob's death, he and Patricia were on the verge of finalizing a divorce, and Bob's will left her everything. Robert Crane pointed out that Patricia stood to gain financially if Bob died before the divorce was final, insinuating a possible motive. However, police never found any evidence implicating her, and investigators have publicly stated they do not consider her a suspect. Other theories frame the entire thing as a massive Hollywood conspiracy, though there's really so many variants on it that it would require its own dedicated video on the topic. On a cold Saturday night in February 2005, Danielle Imbo and Richard Petrone left a bustling Philadelphia bar and seemingly vanished into thin air. The two friends had spent the evening hanging out with another couple at a South Street bar called Abilene's. Around 11:45 p.m., they said their goodbyes and walked towards Richard's black 2001 Dodge Dakota pickup truck, but they were never seen again. The next day, Danielle missed a hair salon appointment, and neither she nor Rich answered their phones, alarming their families. By the time police were notified, there was no trace of the couple or the truck. Danielle, 34, was a mortgage processor from Mount Laurel, New Jersey, and the devoted mother of a young son. She was separated from her husband at the time and had an outgoing, warm personality. Richard, 35, was a lifelong South Philadelphian who worked at his family's bakery. A blue-collar family man, Rich was essentially a single father and did everything for his daughter, according to those who knew him. Danielle and Rich had known each other through Rich's sister and had been dating on and off in the months before they vanished. February 19, 2005 had been an ordinary day that turned into a baffling mystery. Earlier that evening, Danielle had dinner plans with her mother, Rich's mother, and some girlfriends. During the outing, she arranged to meet Rich later for a night out. Rich and Danielle met around 9 p.m. at one bar and then joined another couple at a second bar nearby. Friends described the mood as cheerful and normal, just a casual night out with live music and conversation. Shortly before midnight, the four friends parted ways outside the bar. Danielle and Rich were seen walking hand in hand toward Rich's parked truck, which was conveniently close by. They planned to head back across the river to Danielle's home in New Jersey, a drive that should only have taken 30 minutes. But somewhere between the crowded nightlife of South Street and Danielle's house, they vanished without a trace. No witnesses have ever reported seeing anything unusual. No crash, no struggle, nothing. Traffic cameras and bridge toll records showed no sign of the Dodge Dakota crossing into New Jersey that night. And in the days and weeks that followed, there was zero activity on Danielle's or Richard's cell phones, credit cards, or bank accounts. The Mount Laurel police and Philadelphia police quickly enlisted the FBI, treating the case as a possible abduction or foul play scenario. Despite the late hour, busy city streets like South Street usually have people around, yet no one reported a scream, accident, or disturbance. From the outset, investigators were confronted with a frustrating lack of physical evidence, and Richard's truck has never been found. The FBI's Philadelphia field office took the lead in the investigation, joining forces with the Philadelphia Police, New Jersey State Police, and multiple other agencies. Over the years, this joint task force has conducted hundreds of interviews and chased down leads across the country. Detectives even followed reported sightings as far away as Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, but none of these leads panned out. Investigators methodically checked area bridges, highways, parking lots, chop shops, and waterways for any sign of the missing Dodge truck. In fact, civilian dive teams searched major local rivers multiple times in hopes of locating the vehicle underwater. Now, if this level of intensity for a case where no crime was even proven to have occurred seems odd to you, you won't have to wait long to figure out why this was the case. By 2008, with the case turning colder than a polar bear's ass, the FBI publicly revealed what many had feared. They believed Danielle and Rich were likely victims of a hitman plot. Agents pointed out that there had been no ransom demand, no extortion attempt, and no evidence to suggest a random kidnapping gone wrong. A spokesperson came forward to say that there was likely methodical planning behind the disappearance. What this agent didn't say, though, is who may have been behind it, and the authorities were clear that there were no red flags in their life that would make them a target for a hit. Over 2 decades, a number of theories and rumors have swirled around the Imbo Patron case. One line of speculation was that Richard might have crossed someone dangerous. Some have suggested it's possible he owed money to the wrong people or had ties to organized crime. The FBI dug into his history and found no evidence that Richard was in debt to loan sharks or connected to the mob, or anything else that would make him a target. By all accounts, he was a hard-working baker and devoted dad who wasn't in debt to anyone. That said, this was in the days before serious digital forensic investigation, so I do have some doubts. The most persistent suspicions have centered on personal motives. In particular, Danielle's estranged husband, Joseph Imbo, has been a subject of intense scrutiny. Danielle's split from Joe had been tumultuous. He had cheated on her, and the divorce was bitter and fresh. In the weeks before the disappearance, there was a confrontation where Joe angrily warned Richard to stay away from his wife, even calling Richard at work to threaten him. This history of bad blood made it easy to speculate that a jealous or angry Joe could have orchestrated harm to Danielle and her new boyfriend. In fact, Richard's mother was so suspicious that she tried to confront Joe Imbo at an early press conference, barely a week after the couple went missing. Joe, however, had what police say is a solid alibi. He was attending a family birthday party 50 miles away that night. Several witnesses, including an off-duty police officer, vouched for his presence, and there are allegedly photographs of him at the party. Investigators questioned Joe many times and even had him take a polygraph, but they have never named him as an official suspect. To this day, no arrests have been made, and no person of interest has been publicly identified. Today, the disappearance of Danielle Imbo and Richard Patron remains one of Philadelphia's most notorious unsolved mysteries. After all these years, the authorities are still actively seeking tips and are offering a reward of $50,000 for information leading to answers or an arrest in this case. Hey everyone, Jimmy here once again with a quick reminder to hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to check out my new channel, Lazy Chill Tales, for some seriously creepy stories to chill out or fall asleep to. Deep within the story of human evolution lies the puzzling question of why we're so different from our primate cousins. A bold and controversial theory offers a surprising answer. Perhaps our ancestors once called the coastal waters and rivers their home. The aquatic ape hypothesis presents a fascinating alternative to traditional evolutionary thinking. Picture this. Instead of adapting solely to life on land, our early ancestors may have spent crucial periods living in or near aquatic environments. This watery chapter in our past, the theory suggests, could explain some of humanity's most distinctive features. From our upright walk to our nearly hairless bodies and our remarkable ability to hold our breath, this theory seeks to explain it all. The story begins with Alistair Hardy, who first dared to imagine our ancestors as semi-aquatic beings. Hardy envisioned early humans wading through shallow waters, swimming across rivers, and diving beneath the surface to gather food. In his mind, this aquatic lifestyle provided the evolutionary pressure that shaped us into the unique creatures we are today. Walking upright became advantageous for navigating through water while keeping heads above the surface. The gradual loss of body hair made sense for animals spending significant time submerged. Hardy drew inspiration from nature itself. He looked at seals, otters, and other aquatic mammals in particular. He noted they share traits remarkably similar to humans that seem oddly out of place among typical land dwellers. For years, Hardy's unusual idea remained in the shadows of scientific discourse. Then came the 1970s, when Elaine Morgan breathed new life into the hypothesis. Morgan championed the theory with passionate conviction, arguing that it offered superior explanations compared to the prevailing savanna theory. This is the generally accepted idea that our ancestors evolved their distinctive traits while adapting to life on the open grasslands of East Africa. According to aquatic ape hypothesis proponents, there's a plethora of evidence to support their position. Among all land mammals, humans stand virtually alone in our near-complete hairlessness. This is a trait far more common in dolphins, whales, and other aquatic mammals. Beneath our skin lies a substantial layer of fat, serving the same insulating and buoyancy functions that keep marine mammals comfortable in their watery world. Our upright posture also takes on new meaning when viewed through an aquatic lens. Wading through water while foraging from trees hanging over rivers and shores would have made bipedalism not just useful, but essential for survival. Meanwhile, our sophisticated breath control, crucial for both speech and diving, mirrors capabilities found in marine mammals rather than our terrestrial relatives. Perhaps most intriguingly, humans possess something called the diving reflex. When submerged in water, our bodies automatically slow the heart rate and redirect blood flow. Interestingly, this is a response we share with seals and whales, but not with most land-dwelling mammals. The theory extends beyond physical adaptations to encompass diet and brain development. Proponents argue that early humans living near coastlines would have had access to seafood rich in omega-3 fatty acids. These nutrients, essential for brain growth, might explain the remarkable expansion of human intelligence compared to other primates. In this narrative, our proximity to water didn't just shape our bodies, it also transformed our minds into something more. Yet for all its compelling logic, the aquatic ape hypothesis faces fierce opposition from mainstream science. The most damning criticism centers on a glaring absence: fossil evidence. Archaeological discoveries consistently place early human ancestors in ancient forests and savannas, not along prehistoric shorelines or lake beds. Critics offer alternative explanations that keep our ancestors firmly on dry land. Bipedalism, they argue, evolved as an efficient way to traverse vast grasslands, allowing early humans to cover great distances while conserving energy. The loss of body hair becomes a cooling mechanism for surviving in hot, open environments rather than an aquatic adaptation. The scientific community raises another fundamental concern: the theory's lack of testable predictions. True scientific theories must generate hypotheses that researchers can confirm or refute through experimentation and discovery. Critics contend that the aquatic ape hypothesis primarily seeks to explain existing traits without offering concrete, verifiable predictions about what future evidence should reveal. This limitation has led many to dismiss the theory as speculative storytelling rather than rigorous science. While the aquatic explanation may seem elegantly logical, it remains trapped in the realm of what if, rather than advancing into testable scientific territory. The debate continues to ripple through evolutionary biology, with passionate advocates on both sides presenting their cases. Whether our ancestors ever truly embraced an aquatic lifestyle remains one of evolution's most captivating scientific mysteries. Timothy Pitson, a 6-year-old boy from Aurora, Illinois, vanished in May 2011 under highly unusual and tragic circumstances. Timothy was born on October 18, 2004, to James Pitson and Amy Fry Pitson. On the morning of May 11, 2011, Amy picked Timothy up from his elementary school in Aurora, Illinois. She told school officials there was a quote-unquote family emergency, but no such emergency existed. Amy then took Timothy on a bizarre journey, visiting several verified locations over the next 3 days. Their first stop was the Brookfield Zoo in Brookfield, Illinois. Later, they visited Key Lime Cove Resort in Gurnee, Illinois, where they spent the night. The following day, they traveled to the Kalahari Resort in Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. Security footage from these locations shows Timothy appearing to be unharmed and in good spirits. On May 13th, Amy checked out of the resort alone. This was the last confirmed sighting of Timothy. After leaving the resort, Amy purchased stationery and mailed several letters to family members. That afternoon, she was seen at a grocery store in Rockford, Illinois, where she appeared calm. However, later that day, Amy was found expired in a motel room in Rockford from an apparent you-know-what. And yeah, sorry, I hate censorship too, but chances are you would have never seen my video if I included the actual word. Amy left behind a note stating that Timothy was safe and with people who would care for him. More cryptically, she also wrote that, quote, "He'll never be found." The investigation into Timothy's disappearance began immediately after Amy's body was discovered. Authorities found no trace of Timothy at the motel or in Amy's car, which was littered with small blood stains confirmed to be Timothy's. However, the stains were not significant enough to suggest he had been seriously harmed, and it was later determined that this was likely the result of a nosebleed prior to the abduction. Investigators also discovered that Amy had taken steps to conceal her tracks. For instance, her phone records showed that she had driven to several remote areas before her death, apparently in an attempt to ping cell towers there. Despite extensive searches in the areas she traveled, no meaningful evidence of Timothy's whereabouts was found. Over the years, law enforcement has pursued numerous leads, but most have ended in disappointment. One of the most publicized developments in the case occurred in April 2019, when a young man in Newport, Kentucky, claimed to be Timothy Pitson. He told authorities he had escaped from captors who had held him for years. This claim initially raised hopes that Timothy had been found. However, DNA testing quickly revealed the individual was not Timothy, but a 23-year-old man named Brian Rinne with a history of criminal activities and deception. Notably, Rinne was sentenced to 2 years in prison for the hoax and the harm he inflicted on the Pitson family. Numerous theories have been proposed regarding Timothy's disappearance. The most optimistic theory is that Amy gave Timothy to someone she trusted, as she claimed in her note. This would mean Timothy might still be alive, living under a different identity. However, Skeptics argue that it would be nearly impossible to keep such an arrangement secret for so long, especially with the widespread publicity surrounding the case. That said, others argue that there are numerous cases of parental abductions where children live their life under an assumed identity for decades. Some theorize that Amy may have given Timothy to individuals who were under the belief that Timothy would be endangered if he was returned to his father. Another theory is that Amy may have ended Timothy, though there's no significant evidence to indicate this is the case. Others suggest that Amy might have left Timothy in a remote location where he succumbed to the elements. This theory aligns with the lack of physical evidence and the extensive but fruitless searches in the areas Amy visited. Further, it provides an alternative theory as to why she visited such remote locations. Perhaps she wasn't trying to ping cell towers to throw off investigators. Rather, perhaps she was looking for a location to drop the boy off where he would never be found. Notably, his father, James Pitson, strongly believes his son's still alive. If he is, I have a feeling that one day Timothy will submit his DNA to a genetic testing agency and be in for the surprise of a lifetime. Tiffaine Véron is a French woman who vanished while vacationing in Japan in the summer of 2018. Born in 1982, Véron was 36 years old and worked as a school teaching assistant in France. A seasoned traveler and enthusiast of Japanese culture, she had meticulously planned a 3-week solo trip to Japan, a destination where she had been before. After arriving in Tokyo on July 27, 2018, Tiffaine traveled to the historic city of Nikko, about 100 miles north of Tokyo, that's known for its temples and scenic forests and mountains. She checked into the Turtle Inn in Nikko and spent much of her first day sightseeing. Notably, a typhoon had hit the area on July 28th, which slowed her down as many of the local trails were still in bad shape. On the morning of July 29th, Tiffaine was seen eating breakfast at the inn. She left on foot around mid-morning with a small shoulder bag, leaving all her other belongings, including her luggage, passport, and travel documents, in her room. Unfortunately, she never came back, and the inn's owner reported her missing the next day when she failed to return by July 30th. Tiffaine's last known movements remain largely speculative due to the lack of clear evidence. Multiple witnesses saw her at breakfast on July 29th before she headed out to sightsee. One tourist's photograph from that morning even captured Tiffaine during breakfast in the background, which is always helpful given the fragility of memory. A backpacker later claimed he saw a woman matching her description around midday, walking alone on a forest path in the area. This sighting, if accurate, placed Tiffaine in the wooded trails of Nikko hours after leaving the hotel. This is a detail that raised eyebrows, because heavy rain from the prior day's typhoon had made trails slippery and less frequented by tourists. Tiffaine's family also discovered from her online data that her phone connected to the internet for the last time around 10:30 that morning, after which all signals ceased. When Tiffaine failed to show up or contact anyone by the following morning, it became clear something had gone wrong. Notably, Tiffaine suffered from epilepsy and required medication to manage it. Local authorities responded promptly once Tiffaine was reported missing. The immediate concern was perhaps in the excitement of travel she had forgotten to take a dose of her medication, which led to her falling on the typhoon-battered trail. Within days, dozens of police officers and volunteers were scouring the area, but initially found no trace of her movements. Search efforts focused on the rugged terrain around Nikko, which features dense forests, rivers, and hiking paths. The region's geography is both scenic and perilous, with steep mountain trails and fast-flowing streams where a person could slip and get severely injured, or fall into a typhoon-swollen river. Early search operations included teams on foot, police dogs, divers checking the river, and drones scanning from above. Helicopters were also deployed to survey the mountainous areas around Nikko, particularly near the Daya River and a scenic gorge called Kanmangafuchi Abyss, where tourists often walk. And despite the name, this abyss is actually extremely scenic. And if you're one of those people who just listen, I'd suggest looking at your screen now if you're at all into nature. Despite these extensive efforts, no definitive clues were found in the initial weeks. Tiffane's phone and personal items, aside from those left in her room, were never recovered, and there were no confirmed sightings on security cameras or by other hikers in the days following. As days turned into weeks, Tiffane's family took active roles in the search and investigation. The French embassy in Japan notified her relatives of her disappearance on August 1st, 2018. And to foreshadow a bit, her case has become something of an international incident. Shortly after they were informed, Tiffane's sister and brothers flew to Japan to aid in the search and meet up with local authorities. They initially praised the Japanese police's efforts, but rapidly grew anxious about the pace of the investigation, as well as the focus on an accident rather than foul play. One early complication was that Tiffane's hotel room had been cleaned and rebooked by the innkeeper very soon after she vanished. Unfortunately, this occurred before police could thoroughly examine it. This potentially disturbed a primary scene and made it harder to collect forensic evidence. Language barriers also posed challenges. The Véron family needed translators to communicate with Japanese police, which slowed the exchange of information. Further, Japanese police have consistently maintained there were no clear signs of criminal activity in Tiffane's case, treating it as a missing person case, possibly due to an accident. Indeed, from early on, the Tochigi Prefectural Police leaned toward the hypothesis that Tiffane might have fallen into the river behind her hotel and been swept away. This theory is based on the area's dangers. The inn is near a river, and a fall could be fatal. However, the family found it unconvincing given that thorough searches of the river for several miles turned up no body or belongings. Nonetheless, the family remained determined in the face of adversity. They appeared on Japanese television to plead for help, distributed flyers around Nikko with Tiffane's photo, and spoke with anyone who might have been in the area at the time. By mid-August 2018, roughly 2 weeks into the search, police intensified their efforts around known tourist spots. Despite these thorough searches and even periodic helicopter sweeps of the mountains over the following months, no physical evidence was found. By the end of 2018, authorities indicated they would not conduct new large-scale ground searches unless credible new clues emerged, though they continued to keep an eye out during aerial surveys. Over the course of 2019, numerous investigations were undertaken by the family, as well as private Japanese citizens looking to help in the case. But again, no signs turned up. Tiffane Véron's family has been relentless in pushing for a deeper investigation, both in Japan and through international channels. Within weeks of her disappearance, they reached out to high-level officials for support. Tiffane's mother wrote to French President Emmanuel Macron in August 2018, pleading for more resources and attention on the case. Over the years, the Véron family has organized multiple trips back to Japan, met with police, and held numerous press conferences to keep the spotlight on the case. They've funded private investigators and experts, and even turned to European institutions for support. Their lobbying has caused French members of the European Parliament to press Japan on its obligations of legal cooperation with the EU in such cases. This international pressure has caused Japanese police to keep investigating the case. From the outset, theories about what happened to Tiffane Véron have centered on two main possibilities: a fatal accident or foul play. As already discussed, the Japanese investigators have generally favored the accident hypothesis, having found no evidence in support of foul play. I'm not going to fully go through it again, but they generally focus on the fact that she may have been walking near a river on a slippery path and may have had a seizure or sudden fainting spell. All the evidence for this is circumstantial, and no trace of Tiffany has ever been found in the area of the river. The other leading explanation is foul play, which Tiffany's family firmly believes is the more likely scenario, and several factors fuel this theory. Tiffany disappeared in broad daylight from a populated tourist town, which is in and of itself highly unusual. The fact that her phone abruptly went offline is seen as suspicious by some. The family interprets this as a sign that something sudden and violent happened, since a simple fall wouldn't necessarily destroy a phone or prevent it from at least pinging the network. Though that said, if she had fallen into the water, this provides a rational alternative explanation for why her phone may have suddenly went offline. Of course, there's always the potential that her phone charge simply ran out, and this entire phone battery issue is a red herring. More troubling is something that emerged from local reports about a sinister individual targeting female tourists traveling alone. This man, who operated in the Nico area, pretended to be a friendly guide to these women, but in reality was known to harass them and assault them when they rejected his advances. This raised alarm that Tiffany could have encountered someone with ill intentions. Police later tracked this man down and interrogated him. They've officially stated that this individual was not in the area at the time and was not considered a suspect, but the mere existence of such a person added to fears of foul play. Further, the family also has concerns that the Japanese police investigative files were either incomplete or that the investigation itself was of poor quality. Others have speculated that another criminal might have taken advantage of her trust, given the reputation of Japan as one of the safest countries in the world. Other less prevalent theories have occasionally been floated, though they have essentially no supporting evidence. One is that Tiffany might have chosen to disappear intentionally for personal reasons. Others have proposed the potential for a wild animal encounter gone wrong, but again, no supporting evidence exists. As of now, Tiffany's family continues to strongly advocate for justice for her and won't let her case be forgotten. On February 10, 1998, a maintenance worker at the Spanish Gates apartment complex in Glendale, Colorado, noticed a foul odor coming from what should have been an empty unit. Upon investigating, the worker found the decomposing body of a young adult male on the floor. Police were alerted and arrived to a grim scene. The deceased man lay surrounded by large amounts of cash and various substances strewn about the apartment. Investigators determined he had been dead for approximately 3 days by the time he was found. There were no signs of foul play at the scene. Instead, the evidence pointed to a fatal overdose. An autopsy later confirmed extremely high levels of heroin in his system, confirming that he likely accidentally administered too much of the substance to himself. Shockingly, as investigators secured the scene, an incident occurred that briefly stole headlines. A Glendale police officer who responded that day was caught attempting to steal some of the cash found with the body. According to contemporaneous reports, another officer saw him trying to pocket the money, and he was arrested and charged with the theft. Detectives soon realized the unidentified man had been living under multiple false identities. In the apartment, they found several forms of identification, including a Texas state ID card in the name Diego Perez. At first glance, it looked like a legitimate driver's license, and in fact, it was an authentic ID issued by Texas authorities, but the credentials used to obtain it were stolen. The address on that card, 501 East 8th Street in Austin, Texas, turned out to be a homeless shelter formerly run by the Salvation Army. This suggested that Diego Perez was an assumed identity, likely using a real person's information that the John Doe had fraudulently adopted. In his pockets were additional fake IDs and documents with other names. Investigators soon uncovered at least 5 aliases tied to the same man. He had gone by Julio Costa Lasso, Pablo Marquez Soto, Salvatore Franco, James Edgar, and Armando Aguilar Franco, in addition to the name Diego Perez. Personally, I like that he tossed James Edgar in there just to mix it up a bit, but I'll be coming back to that. It was clear that the man had gone to great lengths to obscure who he really was. Digging deeper, authorities checked law enforcement and immigration databases and were astonished by what they found. The John Doe had a history of encounters with U.S. officials under those assumed names. In fact, multiple Immigration and Naturalization Service records were linked to him, each under a different alias. He had been assigned at least 2 separate alien registration numbers during prior run-ins with immigration authorities. One record showed him detained under the name Franco as far back as May 7, 1986 in Spokane, Washington. Another record under Julio Costa Lasso was also found. These records came with photographs, meaning the government had captured his image on multiple occasions throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The fact that he had brushes with law enforcement and deportation proceedings suggests he may have been involved in illicit activities. Ironically, despite these extensive records and fake identities, authorities couldn't find any trace of his real identity. No fingerprints in national databases matched a known missing person, and every name he used was a dead end. One unusual advantage investigators have in this case is the abundance of photographs of the John Doe while alive. Typically, unidentified persons are known only by reconstructions or gruesome post-mortem images, but this case is different. Because the Doe had been arrested, detained, or otherwise documented multiple times under his aliases, authorities possess nearly a dozen photographs of him from those incidents. These images include mugshots and identification photos taken over the years. In some photos, he wears eyeglasses, and indeed a pair of glasses was found with his belongings when he died. The photos show a Hispanic male with thick, curly black hair and brown eyes. Notably, some have speculated that he may be Afro-Latino based on his appearance, while others have questioned whether he was actually of Hispanic origin at all. After all, he was a chameleon, and what better way to hide his true identity than by further obscuring his true origins? Some have suggested the James Edgar alias is evidence that he may actually have been of African American or a mixed race background, adopting these other aliases as additional cover. Unfortunately, for the reasons I'm about to delve into, it's unlikely that we will ever have a definitive answer. The investigation into Diego Perez's true identity has faced several challenges. A major hurdle is the lack of preserved forensic evidence for modern DNA analysis. Unfortunately, back in 1998, after the autopsy was completed, the man's remains were cremated. At the time, this may have been a routine decision for an unclaimed body, especially one whose cause of death wasn't disputed. However, it has since proved to be a regrettable choice. With the body cremated and thus effectively destroyed, no DNA sample or dental records could be saved for future testing. Unless someone recognizes one of the numerous pictures of this man, it's likely that he will be forever a complete unknown. For over a week, a frightened man in Florida carried the weight of a terrible secret. He had seen a young woman brutally slain in a remote sugarcane field outside Belle Glade, and her desperate last pleas still echoed in his mind. Hiding among the tall stalks, the anonymous hunter watched as 2 men argued with the woman by a blue Ford Bronco. She begged a man she called Ricardito for mercy, but the confrontation turned fatal when he struck her repeatedly with a machete. Afterwards, the horrified witness saw the attackers drag the woman's body deeper into the cane field and drive away. He caught only a glimpse of the Bronco's license plate containing the numbers 7 and 2. Fearing for his own life and aware that he'd been trespassing to hunt, The witness, who gave the name Antonio, waited more than a week before finally calling the authorities. Antonio's delayed call, made nervously in Spanish to a Miami emergency dispatcher, provided just enough clues for authorities to begin their investigation. He directed police to a landmark near the crime scene, a building shaped like an ice cream cone in the Belle Glade area. Palm Beach County detectives recognized this description as the local Twisty Treat ice cream stand, and they rushed to search the fields behind it. There, just as Antonio had described, detectives discovered the remains of a female victim concealed in the tall grass about a mile south of the shop. Finding the body was only the beginning of a difficult investigation. The victim's remains were badly decomposed, indicating she had been lying out in the Florida heat for roughly a week or more. The attack had been vicious. An autopsy determined the woman died from multiple deep-cutting wounds consistent with a machete, reflecting a horrifying level of brutality. Because of advanced decomposition, the corpse was already transitioning into a mummified state. Identifying the victim was a challenge. Most of her fingers had skeletonized, but detectives managed to obtain one viable thumbprint from her right hand. Incredibly, that single thumbprint was enough to confirm the victim's identity as Rebecca Young, a local young woman who had been reported missing in Belle Glade. Rebecca Young was just 21 years old at the time of her death and a longtime resident of the Belle Glade community. In a cruel twist of fate, investigators learned that violence had already touched Rebecca's life years before. When Rebecca was only 12, her own mother had been slain, an event that left deep scars on Rebecca. After that tragedy, Rebecca was raised by her aunt, Lucille Williams, with whom she shared a close bond. As detectives dug into Rebecca's background for clues, they uncovered signs that her life had taken a difficult turn in the years leading up to her slaying. After high school, Rebecca became involved with an older man known around town as a petty criminal. This man, whose sources called her quote-unquote boyfriend, drew Rebecca into a dangerous lifestyle, introduced her to illegal substances, and forced her into illicit work. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that while he may have sold her the boyfriend line, I'm thinking he was something else entirely. Police initially wondered if this quote-unquote boyfriend could be tied to Rebecca's death, given his criminal background and violent behavior. However, after investigation, he was ruled out as a direct suspect, as there was no evidence placing him at the scene. He also didn't fit the description of either of the men who were described by Antonio in the frantic call to the cops. Even so, detectives believe that his criminal activities indirectly set the stage for Rebecca's slaying. One theory is that this man may have angered dangerous individuals in the local drug underworld, and that Rebecca ultimately paid the price for his actions. In other words, Rebecca might have been targeted in retaliation for someone else's wrongdoing. With Rebecca's identity confirmed and her background uncovered, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office pressed forward to find her killers. They had scant physical evidence from the crime scene, so detectives focused on leads from the 911 call and the streets of Belle Glade. Antonio, the eyewitness, had provided a few critical details. One perpetrator's nickname, Ricardito, the description of 2 Hispanic males, and the blue Ford Bronco with a partial license plate containing 7 and 2. Police checked records for vehicles matching the description and canvassed local informants for any mention of someone named Ricardito. Unfortunately, the nickname didn't immediately match any known suspects in the area. A breakthrough hint surfaced about 3 weeks after the slaying. On May 14, 1991, the sheriff's department detained a local man who had allegedly told a lady of the night that he had slain a woman who met Rebecca's description recently. Disturbingly, this wasn't told to her as some sort of direct threat, but rather as some sort of chilling boast about what he had allegedly done. This individual, whose name has never been released publicly, became a prime person of interest. Detectives located him driving a blue vehicle and used a traffic stop as a pretext to bring him in for questioning. The situation grew even more suspicious when, before investigators even mentioned any further crimes, the man blurted out that he knew they wanted to talk to him about a slaying. This unsolicited statement raised red flags, as it suggested he was aware of Rebecca's case or had a guilty conscience. Detectives attempted to interview the man, but the suspect quickly invoked his right to an attorney and refused to answer questions. Lacking any hard evidence tying him to the crime, the police had no choice but to release him from custody. Despite the setback, investigators remained convinced that this unnamed individual was involved. With the investigation stalling, law enforcement's best hope was to find the one person who saw everything, the mysterious caller known only as Antonio. Detectives launched an all-out search for this Good Samaritan witness, emphasizing that he was not in any trouble and could hold the key to solving the case. Little is known about Antonio beyond the brief call he made. He told the 911 dispatcher that he was using a payphone because he had no phone at home. This suggested he might have been from a poorer community or was working as a migrant laborer, and perhaps may have been in the United States illegally. From his accent and language, police believe Antonio is likely Cuban. Unfortunately, despite numerous calls for Antonio to come forward, he has never resurfaced. Unsurprisingly, it hasn't been all that easy to locate a Cuban guy in Miami named Antonio, at least, not the correct one. Decades have now passed since Rebecca Young's life was viciously cut short, and there's been little in the way of progress. Her family and the community have never forgotten the quiet young woman who fell victim to such a cruel fate. At present, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office continues to treat the case as an active and ongoing investigation, despite the fact that the case has gone cold. Personally, I think that the key to the case is the so-called boyfriend. I suspect he knows exactly who did it and why. In the early morning of April 29, 1965, Captain Charles Shelton bailed out of his stricken reconnaissance jet over Laos and parachuted into the unknown. It was his 33rd birthday, but instead of celebrating with his family, he spent those hours evading enemy search parties in the jungle below. Shelton could not have known that day would mark the beginning of a decades-long mystery, one that would see him become the last official U.S. prisoner of war of the Vietnam era. His disappearance sparked a decades-long quest for answers and remains one of the Vietnam era's most haunting mysteries. Charles was an Air Force pilot on a top-secret reconnaissance mission when fate struck. He had been flying an RF-101C Voodoo jet over northern Laos, gathering intelligence in a conflict the U.S. was not officially acknowledging. To maintain secrecy, he wore a sanitized uniform with no identifying insignia, thus keeping plausible deniability. On April 29, 1965, hostile ground fire hit Shelton's plane. He managed to eject safely, radio his location to friendly forces, and land by parachute in rugged enemy-held terrain. Rescue helicopters scrambled to reach him, but monsoon clouds and mountainous jungle forced them to turn back empty-handed. They wouldn't abandon this man by any means, but the risk was simply too great that further casualties would be sustained if they didn't wait out the torrential rains. Back home, at the very same time, his wife Marion had been preparing a small birthday celebration in her husband's absence when the awful news arrived. And keep Marion's name in mind here, because she's someone who quite literally went to hell and back to get answers about what happened to her husband. For a few days, search teams scoured the jungle without success. Then, About 6 days after the crash, word reached the Air Force that a downed American pilot had been captured by communist Pathet Lao forces. Villagers in the remote region reported seeing an American pilot dragged off into the jungle, confirming that Charles Shelton was alive but now a prisoner. These forces that took him were known for their extreme brutality, making the situation more concerning than it already had been. The Air Force soon forwarded Marion some of Charles's personal effects, including his dog tags and military ID card. These items would normally have stayed with a pilot, so their return implied he was captured and had been relieved of his identification by the enemy. Being captured was only the beginning of Shelton's ordeal. Over the years, sporadic reports trickled out of Laos about an American captive who matched Shelton's description. Fellow prisoners of war repatriated from Vietnam told of a resilient pilot still being held in Laos. Importantly, these accounts were largely secondhand in nature, simply things they had heard through the grapevine while being held prisoner. One particularly harrowing account described an American kept in a bamboo cage or underground pit, defying his captors at every turn. Shelton's family heard that he had attempted escape multiple times, and even that he fought back ferociously during interrogations. According to one story, he managed to overpower several guards, an act of bravery that led his captors to label him incorrigible and possibly retaliate with lethal force. Such accounts were impossible to verify, but they kept alive a glimmer of hope alongside the gnawing fear of what he might be suffering. Back home in Kentucky, the Shelton family refused to let Charles become just another name on the growing list of missing servicemen. His wife Marion and their 5 children held on to hope through years of silence. When the American involvement in Vietnam drew to a close in early 1973, they anticipated that Charles might finally come home. President Nixon announced that all American prisoners would be released, and lists were published naming those returning and those who had perished in captivity. But then something disturbing happened. Marion's heart sank when she saw Charles's name listed among the dead. Officially, the U.S. government asserted that no POWs remained alive in Southeast Asia after 1973, but Marion was unconvinced. She became one of the strongest advocates not just for her own husband, but for all the men who were still potentially lost or captive. Determined to find any trace of her husband, Marion embarked on a bold journey into the war-torn region where Charles had vanished. In mid-1973, against State Department advice, she secretly traveled to Laos, a country then controlled by communist forces, to search for clues. Accompanied by a journalist ally, she met with villagers and shadowy informants who claimed an American pilot was being held in a cave in the mountains. Though she found no concrete evidence, Marion's resolve only grew. Even after returning home empty-handed, she continued to chase every lead. Reports from refugees and declassified documents hinted that some U.S. airmen were still alive years after the conflict. In one document obtained via the Freedom of Information Act, a source claimed that Charles Shelton had been seen alive as late as 1983, nearly 2 decades after his capture. These whispers of survival fueled Marion's quest and made her an outspoken advocate in the national movement to return these men home. After decades of fruitless searches and unfulfilled promises, the emotional toll on the Shelton family was immense. By the late 1980s, Marion's relentless fight had consumed her life and health. She made impassioned public appeals and appeared on television to keep the issue alive. But behind the scenes, she fell into despair and substances. In 1980, a Pentagon board moved to declare Charles dead, but Marion successfully appealed. In 1984, the Air Force Secretary personally intervened to keep Shelton listed as a POW, the only Vietnam-era serviceman still officially not presumed dead. This decision was a symbolic victory, but also a constant reminder that her husband was still missing. The unresolved loss eventually became too much for Marion to bear, and sadly, on October 4th, 1990, she lost her battle with the depressive results of losing Charles. In the aftermath of Marion's death, the 5 Shelton children sought to finally bring closure to a saga that had defined and consumed their family. They petitioned the Air Force to change their father's status once and for all. On September 20th, 1994, the U.S. Air Force officially declared Colonel Charles Shelton killed in action. The following month, a memorial service with full military honors was held at Arlington National Cemetery, where his name was inscribed on the same headstone as Marion's. High-ranking officers, including the Air Force Chief of Staff, attended to pay respects to a man who had become a symbol of all the missing American soldiers in the conflict. Ultimately, the mystery of his fate remains unknown, but it does appear that he survived at least for some time in captivity. Many historians believe that he most likely succumbed to brutal treatment at the hands of his captors. What is certain is that Shelton's story gave a very public face to all the servicemen who were missing and never accounted for in Southeast Asia. Hey everyone, just a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to 2 of your friends or family members that appreciate mysteries of all kinds. Also, feel free to check out the YouTube membership and the Patreon to support my content creation further. Imagine a city built almost entirely of wood, from its homes and shops to the sidewalks underfoot. Now picture that city after a rainless summer, its timbers dry as tinder, when a spark hits at exactly the wrong place. In October 1871, that spark found Chicago, and within hours an inferno engulfed the metropolis. By the time the flames died out, a third of the city lay in ruins, and 100,000 people were left homeless. The Great Chicago Fire remains one of the most infamous urban disasters, a catastrophe so dramatic that its true story is often obscured by myth drilled into us in school as fact. On the night of Sunday, October 8, 1871, a fire began in a barn on the city's southwest side. The blaze likely started around 8:30 p.m., and within minutes it was out of control, fueled by dry fodder and driven by a fierce southwest wind toward the heart of the city. Initial firefighting efforts were hampered by exhaustion and confusion. The city's 185 firefighters had been battling blazes for days, and a reporting error sent crews to the wrong location at first. Meanwhile, flames raced through densely built wooden neighborhoods, leaping the Chicago River and igniting the downtown business district. By Monday morning, chaos ruled as residents fled for their lives. Many ran as far east as they could, onto the Lake Michigan shoreline, and even waded into the water to escape the relentless flames. Heat and updrafts spawned fire whirls, tornadoes of flame that lifted burning debris high into the sky. Blazing embers rained down to spark new fires, even leaping the river when some landed on a railroad car carrying kerosene on the far side. The fire roared northward through the night, consuming almost everything in its path in an unrelenting wall of flame. Early on October 10th, nature lent a hand. A much-needed rain began to fall, helping extinguish the last flames. By the time it was over, the fire had raged for 30 hours, killing an estimated 300 people and reducing 3.3 square miles of the city to ash. Some 17,000 buildings were destroyed, causing $200 million in damage and leaving 1 in 3 residents homeless, as entire neighborhoods vanished. Large portions of Chicago were now a smoldering wasteland of charred rubble and chimneys, as far as the eye could see. The exact cause of the Great Chicago Fire was never officially determined, though there is, of course, a story I assume the vast majority of you are already familiar with as historical fact. Popular legend blames a cow in Catherine O'Leary's barn, kicking over a lantern and starting the blaze. Mrs. O'Leary denied this story, and historians have cast doubt on the cow and lantern tale. It was an easy scapegoat, but no evidence ever proved the cow story true. Other theories suggest a neighbor's accident, or even a falling meteor could have sparked the blaze. In fact, other devastating fires erupted that same night around Lake Michigan, lending some credence to the meteor theory. Some scientists believe that this debris could have sparked a trail of fires when combined with the dry conditions. In truth, all we know is that the fire likely began in or around the O'Leary barn that night. Whether through human carelessness, bovine negligence, or a celestial object, a small flame caught hold and found perfect conditions to explode into a firestorm. Chicago in 1871 was a disaster waiting to happen. More than 2/3 of its structures were made of wood. Roofs were often covered in tar or wooden shingles, and even the sidewalks and roads were made of wood. After a nearly 3-month drought, the city was tinder dry. The day before, firefighters had battled a large blaze that left them exhausted and their equipment damaged. When the O'Leary barn ignited, Chicago's overtaxed firefighters were slow to respond due to confusion and faulty alarms. Under these conditions, even quote-unquote fireproof brick and stone buildings eventually ignited as their interiors baked from the extreme heat. It was a perfect storm of drought, wind, wooden buildings, and human error that conspired to turn a small barn fire into a citywide cataclysm for the ages. In the immediate aftermath, stunned survivors wandered through the ruins as authorities struggled to maintain order. Reports of looting forced officials to summon militias, and martial law was declared for weeks. Relief efforts began at once. Aid poured in from across the country and overseas to help the 100,000 displaced residents. The British sent assistance. A donation from England helped establish Chicago's first free public library as a symbol of the city's rebirth. Fortunately, key infrastructure such as railroads and stockyards lay outside the burn zone and continued to function, so the city's economic lifeline survived to fuel the recovery. Rebuilding began immediately. Within weeks, Chicago elected a new mayor who pushed for stricter building codes and fire safety measures. The city soon passed regulations requiring fireproof materials, spurring a shift from wood to brick and stone in new construction. Chicago's population grew from about 324,000 before the fire to nearly 1 million by 1890. In the following decades, Chicago became a center of architectural innovation, giving rise to some of the world's first modern skyscrapers. Despite the horror of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire forged an enduring legacy of resilience. Its memory is woven into the city's identity, and one of the 4 stars on Chicago's flag commemorates the fire. The cow story may have become folklore around the nation and internationally, but in a 1997 twist, the city officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary and her cow from blame. In the harsh expanse of the Colorado Desert in southeastern California, a set of giant figures lies etched into the earth, visible almost only from the sky. These are the Blythe intaglios, enormous geoglyphs near the town of Blythe, California, not far from the Colorado River on the border with Arizona. Intaglios are a form of rock-based art, generally practiced by pre-modern humans, often for unknown reasons. Modern awareness of these figures dates to 1932, when a pilot flying between Blythe and Las Vegas noticed unusual shapes on the desert surface. His discovery prompted a survey by the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles that same year. While local indigenous peoples likely knew of these sacred sites, non-native people had overlooked them for centuries due to their grand scale and ground-level obscurity. The intaglios are situated on two low desert mesas about 15 miles north of Blythe, just west of U.S. Highway 95. This remote location kept them hidden from outsiders until the age of aviation. The Blythe intaglios consist of 6 large figures arranged in 3 groups across the desert floor. In total, there are 3 human figures, 2 animal figures, and 1 spiral design. They were created by scraping aside the dark surface stones to reveal lighter sand and soil beneath, a method similar to that used for the much more famous Nazca lines in Peru. The removed stones were piled along the edges of the designs, and the exposed ground was compacted. This technique has helped the figures endure by inhibiting plant growth on the lines. The largest of the human figures is an awe-inspiring 170 feet long from head to toe. The smallest human figure is about 100 feet long. Each human is rendered in a simple form, a torso deeply dug into the earth with outstretched arms and legs that are more shallowly etched. The animal shapes are more abstract, with some observers thinking they resemble horses, though others interpret them as mountain lions. Keep this horse theory in mind as we go forward, because American prehistory buffs will know that horses vanished in the Americas long ago. One figure is a coiled spiral about 30 feet across, believed by some to represent a snake. Scattered around the intaglios are also geometric alignments and large circles. One circular clearing, roughly 140 feet in diameter, is believed to have been a dance area, perhaps used for ritual gatherings. These gigantic designs are virtually imperceptible from ground level, and to a person walking among them, they just seem like random patches of bare soil amid gravel. Much like the Nazca lines, it's only from high above that the intentional shapes emerge. The creation of these figures required coordination and effort, suggesting they held great meaning for their makers. Mystery surrounds the questions of who made the Blythe intaglios and why. Mainstream archaeologists haven't reached consensus on their exact age or function. No organic material was directly left in the designs to allow straightforward carbon dating, but some attempts to date them through indirect means have been made. Radiocarbon dating of nearby sediment and artifacts has yielded a broad range of dates from as early as 900 BC up to around 1200 AD. This suggests the intaglios could be as much as 2,000 to 3,000 years old, though their true age remains uncertain. Some scholars believe they were created by the ancestors of today's Mojave and Quechan tribes, who still inhabit the region. That said, they don't appear to have any oral histories related to claiming the Blythe intaglios as their own creations, putting this theory in question, though I'll come back to this shortly. Others have hypothesized much older dates. According to this claim, if the animal figures really depict horses, they might date back to the end of the last ice age when native wild horses roamed this region. However, others take the horse narrative and drastically swing the other way. They instead propose that the formations were made after the reintroduction of the animal to the region. It's believed that by the middle of the 16th century, horses had gradually been reintroduced to the region. Because no known texts or direct oral histories definitively explain the Blythe geoglyphs, researchers have proposed various theories about their purpose. Many believe these giant drawings had ceremonial or religious significance. The presence of the large circle or dance ring and other patterned alignments suggests gatherings or rituals took place on these sites. One line of thought is that the figures were intended as part of ceremonial processions or pilgrimages, for example, stops along a long ritual journey. Others believe that the figures represent events from the cosmology of the people in the region, and may be intended to be viewed by a spiritual personification of the sky, or a sky god. Thus, the reason why the figures don't appear to be anything on the ground is because they simply aren't meant to be viewed by humans, but rather by some form of divinity. Still others have proposed that the figures serve an astrological or astronomical purpose, though the meaning hasn't been meaningfully decoded. What all researchers and theorists can agree on is that these intaglios were not mere doodles or idle artwork. The labor required to produce figures of this scale indicates a deliberate intention, likely rooted in the spiritual or social life of the culture that made them. Although the true originators of the Blythe intaglios cannot be named with certainty, the native peoples of the region do have their own understanding of these giants on the ground. According to Mojave tradition, the human figures represent Mastamo, the creator of all life. In Mojave belief, Mastamo is a central figure who formed the Colorado River and taught the people how to live. The animal figures, in turn, are said to represent mountain lion siblings who assisted Mastamo in the creation of the world. These interpretations align with the idea that the geoglyphs depict characters from the tribe's creation stories, essentially marking the very landscape with the presence of their deities. Yet, interestingly, no tribe today claims human authorship of the Blythe intaglios. There's a sense that these figures have simply always been there, placed long ago by powerful forces or ancient people now forgotten. A 3-year-old girl stood crying on the stairs, locked out of her home, while unimaginable violence unfolded below. It was the afternoon of February 19th, 1982, in a quiet Woonsocket, Rhode Island apartment house, when a neighbor opened the basement door to a nightmare. Blood was spattered across the laundry room walls. 22-year-old Doreen Picard lay slumped between a washer and dryer, bludgeoned beyond recognition, and strangled with her own sweater. Nearby, 27-year-old Susan Lafert was barely alive in a pool of blood. Susan miraculously survived after hours of surgery, but she emerged from her coma with total amnesia about the attack. With Susan unable to remember the attack and a toddler the only other witness, detectives had little to go on in 1982. The perpetrator had left behind a bloodied 28-inch pipe in the basement, but no fingerprints could be lifted from it. Investigators could not discern a clear motive. Susan was a housewife, and Doreen a young student, neither with any known enemies or dark secrets that might invite such violence. Detectives were struck by the ferocity of the crime, and early theories ranged widely. The attacker could have been a stranger responding to a classified ad, since Lafert had advertised puppies for sale. Doreen's distraught family began their own inquiries and pressed authorities not to give up. Doreen's father even received an anonymous phone call warning him to stop pursuing the case, a chilling sign that someone was nervous about the family's search for the truth. But despite their persistence, months turned into years, with no arrest. The case slowly went cold, and the community remained on edge knowing a predator was still at large. The long-dormant case gained new momentum after a 1988 feature on Unsolved Mysteries, which brought in fresh tips. I feel like this show needs no introduction, but if you're not familiar with it, it showcased unsolved crimes and other mysteries. In 1990, a crucial lead finally emerged. A local man, 36-year-old Daniel Shaw, came forward and implicated his friend Beaver Tempest in the crime. Tempest, a 37-year-old truck driver, was a friend of the Lafert family and had visited the house that day to pick up a pit bull puppy they offered him. Tempest had been on police radar since 1982, but there was never enough evidence to charge him until these new witnesses emerged. There were even rumors that Tempest had been having an affair with Susan, a situation that could have led to a heated confrontation in the basement. In June 1991, Tempest was finally indicted for Doreen Pickard's slaying, nearly a decade after the crime, and the case went to trial the following year. At trial, Rhode Island prosecutors laid out a dramatic narrative of jealousy and rage. They argued that Tempest got into a violent argument with Susan in the basement, and then fatally attacked Doreen when she unwittingly walked in on the scene. According to this theory, he strangled Doreen with her own sweater and bludgeoned both women with a metal pipe before fleeing. It was a compelling story, but it lacked any physical evidence, and nothing at the scene tied Tempest to the crime. Instead, the prosecution's case hinged on a handful of acquaintances who claimed that, in the years following the attack, Tempest had privately confessed to them. These witnesses had checkered histories involving significant criminal activities, calling their credibility into question. One witness even claimed Tempest bragged that he would get away with it because he had family members in law enforcement. Still, taken together, the testimony of these individuals painted Tempest as a man who had boasted about committing the crime. In April 1992, the jury found Beaver Tempest guilty in Doreen Pickard's demise. He was sentenced to 85 years in prison, but Tempest continued to insist he was innocent, even as he was led away in handcuffs. For many locals, the conviction brought relief that someone was held accountable, but others were uneasy with how it was obtained. The Tempest family's deep ties to law enforcement fueled debate. Raymond's late father had been a highly placed Woonsocket police official, and his brother, Gordon Tempest, was a sergeant in the department who took part in the early investigation. Some thought the family's connections had helped Raymond evade suspicion, while others believed internal police rivalries had made him a target. In a startling twist after the trial, Gordon Tempest was convicted in 1993 of perjury for lying under oath about aspects of another case. The sight of a police officer, the defendant's own brother, being punished for lying about evidence added to the doubt surrounding the investigation. This fact seemed to seal the idea that Beaver had done it, and his corrupt family had covered for him. This, of course, matched the narrative that Tempest himself allegedly had spun up. For the next 2 decades, Beaver Tempest pursued every legal avenue to prove he had been wrongfully convicted. Eventually, the New England Innocence Project took up Tempest's case. They re-examined the old evidence and uncovered stunning new information. For example, one key witness had initially given a statement that contradicted her trial testimony. Inconsistencies the state never revealed to the defense. They also discovered that the detective's original informant was a man with a personal grudge against the Tempest family, and that fact was never shared with the defense either. Investigators had even coached the witnesses on what to say, gently reminding them, repeatedly, that Beaver Tempest had confessed to the crime. Piece by piece, Tempest's team built the case that his 1992 conviction was founded on unreliable, manipulated evidence. In 2015, Tempest's lawyers filed for post-conviction relief. A Rhode Island Superior Court judge agreed that the original trial was flawed to the point that Beaver Tempest was denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. In July 2015, he vacated Tempest's conviction, ruling that prosecutors had withheld exculpatory evidence. After spending 23 years in prison, Tempest was released on bail that fall, awaiting a new trial. The next year, 2016, the Rhode Island Supreme Court upheld the decision, affirming that Tempest's conviction couldn't stand given the misconduct and new evidence. For the first time in over 2 decades, Tempest was out from behind bars, at least for the time being. Even after the courts overturned the conviction, state prosecutors were reluctant to let the case go. They initially announced plans to retry Tempest for the slaying of Doreen Pickard. By then, the evidence against him had been severely undermined, and memories had faded. Rather than risk a second trial and a possible life sentence, Tempest made a consequential choice. In December 2017, he entered an offered plea, a legal mechanism whereby a defendant doesn't admit guilt, but acknowledges that the prosecution has enough evidence to convict. In exchange, he received a sentence of time served. This meant that, with the decades he had already spent behind bars, Tempest would serve no further prison time. He walked out of court a free man, still proclaiming his innocence, even if he had to legally say there was evidence to convict him. And just to put this in perspective, he faced two choices: to either take the offered plea and get released immediately, or to roll the dice with the rest of his life after decades in prison. If he is indeed innocent, despite the offered plea, then that must have been a hell of a difficult decision to make. Ultimately, it remains unclear what really happened to Doreen and Susan that day in February. The case is officially closed, and Beaver Tempest has officially been convicted of the crime. Unfortunately, this is a case where a botched investigation has prevented true justice from being served in any event. If Beaver did it, he's now out free when he should still be behind bars for the attacks. If he's innocent, Beaver now has this millstone around his neck for the rest of his life, and the guy who actually did it could still be walking free, knowing he got away with it completely.